Okay, imagine this. You go in expecting maybe an ADHD diagnosis, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? But then you walk out and there's this second diagnosis tacked on, and it turns out that's not unusual at all. Actually, it's pretty common. We're looking at a huge comorbidity rate here. So today we're doing a deep dive into ADHD and its very frequent companion, Oppositional Defiant Disorder, ODD. Our mission really is to unpack the sources you've given us, figure out how these two are different, where they overlap, and why they show up together so often.
Yeah, and understanding that why is critical because the statistic is, well, it's quite striking. Research suggests over half, maybe even up to 60% of individuals with ADHD also meet the criteria for ODD. That kind of linkage means you can't really address one without considering the other. You have to see the connection.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start with the basics. ADHD, the sources define it as one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders. We're talking difficulty with attention, hyperactivity, poor impulse control. Prevalence in the U.S. is around 8.4% for kids and maybe 2.5% for adults. Pretty significant numbers.
And it's helpful to remember the three main types, just quickly. There's the inattentive type, think forgetfulness, trouble organizing. Then the hyperactive impulsive type, fidgeting, interrupting, lots of movement. And finally, the combined type, which is, well, a mix of both. Oh, and an important point for adults, that hyperactivity. It often shifts inward. It becomes more like extreme restlessness, a constant need for mental engagement, rather than obvious physical bouncing around.
Right, that internal restlessness. Now, before we jump to ODD, let's clarify something you mentioned, poor impulse control, difficulty organizing. That sounds like what the experts call executive dysfunction. That seems key to ADHD, doesn't it?
Absolutely key. You've hit the nail on the head. Executive dysfunction is kind of an umbrella term. It refers to the brain's management system, the control center. Think of it like the brain's CEO office. It handles planning, organizing, regulating emotions, shifting focus, setting priorities, and crucially for this talk, applying the brakes on impulses. With ADHD, that CEO office isn't always running smoothly. Sometimes the connections are spotty, or the brakes just don't engage quickly enough.
Okay, that CEO analogy helps. So ADHD stems from that C-suite, that control system not working quite right, a deficit of control. So then how does ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, fit in? Is it related to that same control issue?
That's where the distinction becomes really important. ODD is classified differently. It's primarily seen as a behavioral disorder, not purely neurodevelopmental like ADHD. ODD is defined by this consistent pattern of irritable mood, anger, being argumentative, defiant, especially towards authority figures. It typically shows up early, usually before age 8, almost always before 12. And the prevalence varies quite a bit, somewhere between 1 and 16% of kids and adolescents.
That timeline difference is interesting. ADHD is often lifelong, a core part of how someone's brain works. But ODD sounds more like a childhood phase for many.
That's generally true, yes. ODD is often diagnosed in childhood, and it can resolve as kids mature, learn coping skills, or their environment changes. However, and this is a big however, when those ODD symptoms do stick around, particularly into the teen years or adulthood, it's often because there's that underlying comorbid ADHD fanning the flames. The executive dysfunction from ADHD makes it harder to manage the ODD behaviors. So if left untreated, ODD symptoms can certainly persist.
Which brings us right back to that huge 60% overlap. If they're clinically distinct, one neurodevelopmental, one behavioral, why are they paired up so often? What are the shared risk factors? What makes someone more likely to have both this attention deficit and this defiance pattern?
It's a really complex picture, you know.
Yeah.
The classic nature versus nurture debate. Researchers don't think ADHD causes ODD or vice versa. It's more like they share some common underlying vulnerabilities or pathways. A 2017 study looked into this, trying to identify those shared risks. Some are what you might expect. Having parents with ADHD, experiencing significant adverse life events, exposure to harsh discipline or very critical parenting. Also, things like lower socioeconomic status and associating with, as the study put it, deviant peer affiliations.
Okay. Those make a certain kind of sense: genetics, stressful environments, difficult upbringing. But the sources mention one risk factor that really surprised me: higher birth weight. That seems completely backward. Usually you hear about low birth weight being a risk factor for issues.
It is counterintuitive, isn't it? And that's likely why it stood out in the research. The study didn't definitively explain the why behind that link, but the leading hypothesis involves early neurodevelopment. The idea is that both conditions might have roots in very early developmental processes, maybe even prenatal. Sometimes higher birth weight can be linked to certain maternal health factors or slightly atypical fetal development patterns that might subtly influence later neurological pathways involved in emotion regulation and impulse control. It's definitely an area needing more research.
Fascinating. Okay, let's really unpack this. If we want to tell these two conditions apart, especially when they occur together, we need to look past just the behavior, right? We need to get at the why, the intention, or maybe the lack of intention behind what someone does. That feels like the core distinction we need you, the listener, to grasp.
Exactly. Using your CEO analogy again. With ADHD, the disruptive behavior often comes from a place of can't. The executive functions aren't working well enough to stop it. With ODD, the behavior is often more rooted in won't. It's a pattern of active defiance, anger, and hostility.
Can you give us a concrete example? Make that difference really clear.
Sure, let's take that common scenario. A child grabs a toy from another child. If the child has ADHD, that grab might be purely impulsive. The desire hits, the brakes fail, they act. Often they might feel bad immediately after realizing they broke a rule or hurt someone's feelings, but the impulse just overtook them. It's a failure of executive function.
Okay, the impulsive grab. How does the ODD version look different?
With ODD, that same action, grabbing the toy, is more likely to be driven by something else. Maybe anger at the other child, a desire to deliberately annoy them, or general defiance against the sharing rule. The motive is different. It might be spiteful or vindictive. And when confronted, the child with ODD characteristics is more likely to argue, deny it, blame the other child, or just flat out refuse to give it back. It's less about a momentary lapse in control and more about an intentional, hostile, or defiant stance.
Wow, okay. Impulsivity versus intentional hostility. That's a fundamental difference. It changes everything about how you'd respond or intervene, I imagine. So for someone trying to spot these signs, maybe in their child or even themselves, what are the key symptoms side by side?
Right. For ADHD, think about those functional impacts. Serious trouble organizing tasks, constantly losing things, being forgetful about daily activities.
Yep.
Also the physical side, inability to stay seated when expected, lots of fidgeting, interrupting others frequently, maybe even acting without thinking about danger. It often looks like unintentional chaos.
Okay, functional chaos for ADHD and ODD.
ODD symptoms cluster around mood and interaction. Frequent anger, feeling resentful much of the time, losing their temper easily and often. Behaviorally, it's arguing with adults or authority figures, actively refusing to follow rules or requests, deliberately trying to annoy people, and this is key, blaming others for their own mistakes or misbehavior. That pattern of being spiteful or vindictive is a real hallmark.
Now, are these symptoms always obvious? Do they look the same in everyone, say, between boys and girls?
That's a great question. And no, there can be important differences, especially with ODD. Research shows boys with ODD often display more of that classic overt aggression, physical fights, shouting, openly arguing. It's hard to miss.
Right, the more externalizing behavior.
Exactly. Girls, however, might be more likely to use what's called relational aggression.
Relational aggression, what's that?
It's more indirect. It's about harming someone's social standing, their relationships, or their reputation. Think spreading rumors, intentionally excluding someone, manipulating social situations to isolate a person. It's a more socially calculated form of hostility.
Like social sabotage?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And because it's less overt, less physically disruptive, it can be much harder for parents or teachers to spot. The girl might seem compliant on the surface, but she's engaging in significant aggression behind the scenes.
That's a really important nuance. Okay, let's shift focus to the long game. You mentioned ODD can resolve, but often persists, especially with ADHD. How common is that persistence into adulthood?
It's significantly more likely to persist when ADHD is also present. Those ongoing executive function challenges, especially with emotional regulation, just make it harder to overcome the oppositional patterns. The data backs this up. One source mentioned a study where 43% of adults with ADHD recalled having ODD in childhood. And importantly, in another study, 42% of adults with ADHD currently met the criteria for ODD. So it's definitely not just a childhood issue for a large subset.
And when it does persist into adulthood, particularly untreated alongside ADHD, the consequences sound pretty serious. The sources mention links to substance abuse, domestic violence, even incarceration.
Yes, the risks are substantially higher. Untreated ODD in adulthood, especially combined with the impulsivity of ADHD, creates a difficult combination.
Before it gets to those extremes, how might adult ODD show up in everyday life, like at work or in a relationship?
It often matures from childhood defiance into more, adult forms of conflict and disruption. In relationships, you might see someone who frequently picks fights, seems to thrive on drama, has a very short fuse leading to adult temper tantrums, or uses deliberately hurtful words to control or wound their partner. At work, it could look like constantly challenging supervisors, refusing constructive feedback, blaming coworkers when things go wrong, maybe undermining team projects if they feel slighted. There's often a pattern of instability, like frequent job changes, often framed as being misunderstood or persecuted by management. That core pattern of challenging authority and blaming others continues.
Okay, that paints a clear picture. Let's talk about getting help. Diagnosis. Diagnosing ADHD in kids can be tricky, right? Because some symptoms just look like typical kid behavior. It often involves ruling things out, getting input from school and home.
Yes, it requires demonstrating a persistent pattern across different settings. For ODD, the diagnostic criteria are quite specific. A clinician needs to confirm at least 4 key ODD symptoms are present most days for 6 months or more, and it's usually a thorough process interviews with parents, teachers, sometimes observing the child directly in, say, a playroom setting to see those interactions firsthand.
And the treatments. If we look at them separately first, ADHD often involves medication plus therapy.
That's the standard approach, yes. Medications like stimulants, Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse are common examples, or sometimes non-stimulants, help manage the core symptoms of inattention and impulsivity. But medication isn't a cure, it's symptom management. Therapy, like CBT or skills training, is crucial for developing coping strategies.
And ODD, if it were diagnosed without ADHD.
For ODD alone, the primary treatment is psychotherapy. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, to change negative thought patterns, family therapy to improve interactions at home, or parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT, which coaches parents in real time. Medication generally isn't the first line or even used at all for ODD by itself.
But given that 60% overlap, the reality is often treating both together. How does that change the strategy?
It changes significantly. When both are present, often the first step is addressing the ADHD, particularly the executive dysfunction. So ADHD medications, the stimulants, or sometimes certain antidepressants like Wellbutrin, which can also help with focus and mood, are often prescribed. And interestingly, effectively treating the ADHD symptoms can often lead to a noticeable improvement in the ODD symptoms too. When impulsivity and emotional volatility are better managed by medication, the person has more capacity to engage in therapy and learn to manage the defiance and anger. It makes the psychotherapy for ODD much more effective.
So treat the ADHD foundation first, and that can help the ODD behaviors become more manageable for therapy.
Exactly. You get the brain's CEO office functioning a bit better, and then you can work on the behavioral patterns more effectively. I should also add, in really severe cases where there's significant aggression posing a risk, clinicians might consider atypical antipsychotics like Abilify or Risperdal, but that's usually a later step, done very cautiously due to potential side effects.
Understood. This has been incredibly helpful in untangling a really complex relationship. I think the core message, the key takeaway for you listening is this. ADHD is fundamentally about impulsivity and inattention that struggle with the brain's control systems, the can't. Whereas ODD is characterized by defiance and intentional hostility, more of a pattern of won't, driven by anger and opposition.
Precisely. And recognizing that difference is vital because, as the sources show, when ODD persists alongside ADHD into adulthood, it's linked to higher rates of things like personality disorders and substance abuse, which leaves us with a really important question to think about, drawing from the clinical implications in the sources. If we know this connection exists and has serious long-term consequences, what's the real impact personally and for society of specifically recognizing and treating the ODD component, going beyond just managing the ADHD symptoms and really targeting that pattern of hostility and defiance? How might that change long-term outcomes?
That's definitely something to mull over, the ripple effects of effective, targeted treatment. Thank you so much for walking us through all these layers. It's a challenging topic, but hopefully this deep dive helps you feel more informed about ADHD and ODD. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.